Welcome to Sunday Sermons, brought to you by the Chapel Podcast Network. Let's grab our Bibles and open up to the book of Galatians, chapter 5, verses 16 through 26. And I'll read the first two verses for us now, as we prepare to hear from Tim Latham as he helps us continue in our series titled, Walking the Road Together. But I say, walk by the Spirit, and you will not gratify the desires of the flesh. For the desires of the flesh are against the Spirit, and the desires of the Spirit are against the flesh. For these are opposed to each other, to keep you from doing the things you want to do.
Every summer in high school, I would go down to Montreat, North Carolina for Presbyterian camp. And it was just as much fun as it sounds. It was great. It had amazing preaching and worship. It had mountains and creeks that you could play in. And it had the most amazing general store of my life. It had this general store where it didn't matter how many scoops of ice cream you ordered, they always gave you one more. They factored the taxes into all of their pricing. So if you wanted a glass bottle of root beer, it cost you exactly $1. You'd have to worry about pennies hanging around. And they also sold Presbyterian t-shirts and apparel. And you're looking like, I don't know what that means. What is a Presbyterian t-shirt? Well, my favorite t-shirt in high school I bought at Montreat, it was just blue. And it said, "Have you hugged a Presbyterian today?" across the chest. And I wore that all the time in high school. Jenny married me after I wore that shirt. I wore that shirt in college, and people would say, "There goes that Presbyterian hug guy." But I know they meant it in a really cool way. But for me, Montreat was where I felt closest to God. I would come home on fire. But then back in my ordinary life, in the days and the weeks and the months that came after, that mountaintop experience would sort of leak out. Have you all experienced something like that? Maybe coming home from a mission trip or a conference, maybe a worship service where the sermon or the songs just really spoke to you, where you felt like it changed you. Maybe not even in the church. Maybe you were out in nature, you're praying, and you feel like you were transported somewhere else and your relationship with God deepened. Tommy opened the service today in Acts 2 because today is Pentecost. And I think Pentecost must be the ultimate example of this. Imagine you were there in Jerusalem at the first Pentecost, and you experienced the Spirit in this visceral way. People speaking in tongues, all these different languages, people understanding what was happening. Peter getting up and preaching this bold and amazing sermon, and 3,000 people coming to be baptized. And then you go back home. You go back home to your normal life. You go back home to dealing with sickness and stress, frustrations, death, pain. The church also faces all of these issues throughout Acts. Yes, people were added to their number day by day, but they have all these issues of strife and divisions and confusion and facing persecution. They had to be asking the same question: what do we do now? What do we do when our tongues aren't on fire? What do we do when we're feeling crushed by life? What do we do when the energy from our mission trip, our baptism, our mountaintop experience starts to leak? We must learn to walk in the Spirit, because Pentecost is not the end of the journey. Baptism is not the end either. These are beginnings of a lifelong process of growth. Eugene Peterson calls this the long obedience in the same direction, because it's more about consistency over a long term than intensity for a short burst of time. Consistency, not intensity. We need to walk in the Spirit when we feel on fire for God, and also when we feel completely ordinary, because walking in the Spirit allows us to turn from the works of the flesh and to grow in the fruit of the Spirit. That's what we're talking about today. Turning from the works of the flesh, growing in the fruit of the Spirit. So first, let's talk about the turning from the works of the flesh. There is a battle happening in our text between flesh and the Spirit. Galatians loves a dichotomy. We spent the first several weeks talking about the difference between the law and freedom, and now we're talking about the flesh versus the Spirit, an either or, a before and after, a sharp contrast. Because for Paul, the word sarx that we're translating as flesh, it's more than the Greek understanding of body. It's our sinful nature. It's everything inherent in our human nature that wants the immediately gratifying, that wants to live by worldly standards, that wants to put something else in place of God. We can see how this manifests in the kind of categories that the works of the flesh show up in our text. First, we see them in distorted desires. This is the first three works of the flesh: sexual immorality, impurity, sensuality, sex being a good gift from God, but these good desires have expanded beyond God's parameters to areas outside of God's design for those desires. My friend Corey, who's a pastor, always compares sexual desires to a fire. A fire is great when it's within the confines of your fireplace. It's life-giving. It's not great when it extends past those things, when it's on your floor, when it's surrounding your house, when it's in your pans. Fire is great within the parameters of God's design. The next group is kind of misplaced worship. See, idolatry and sorcery. Sorcery sounds a little bit strange, but it's more than witchcraft and wizardry. These are both things that we are trusting something other than God to give you what only God can. Then we have this longer list of enmity, strife, jealousy, rivalries, dissensions, divisions, envy. These are social sins, broken relationships, things that put barriers in our friendships, in our family, and in our community. And then we have loss of control aspects of the flesh. Drunkenness, orgies. Orgies here refers to the festival of Dionysus. It's not necessarily sexual. It's the festival of Dionysus is what Mardi Gras is based on. This is saying ancient Mardi Gras, where people would lose themselves in the binge drinking, the binge eating, the celebration, the wildness of the festival. These are examples of trying to escape from the reality of your life instead of trusting God. Paul says that all of these works, and even more, all of the works of the flesh are evident. They are obvious, not because they are so rare that they stand out in contrast, but because they're everywhere. They are universally part of this human fleshy experience of life. Paul is saying, even in our freedom from the law, these fleshy desires are not going away. We will be dealing with them for as long as we live. It's like Dale said a few weeks ago. The thing about dead people is they don't sin. But the harsh reality for us is that as long as we are alive, we will be dealing with the problems of the flesh. And yet there is good news here as well, is that God has equipped us with a power that can help us turn away from the works of the flesh, and that is the Holy Spirit. New Testament scholar Thomas Schreiner writes that the passions and desires of the flesh are not absent, but they no longer rule and reign. Those who walk by the Spirit and who are led by the Spirit find themselves, even though imperfectly and partially, triumphing over the passions of the flesh that formerly dominated them. We resist the works of the flesh not by trying harder, but by walking in the Spirit, by trusting God to do things that we cannot do on our own. This is what Paul has been talking about throughout Galatians, even back in Galatians 2. It is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. Christ lives in Paul, and Christ lives in us through the Holy Spirit, which enables us to not only turn away from the works of the flesh, but also to grow in the fruit of the Spirit. He is the one who is doing the work. So let's talk about growing in the fruit of the Spirit. Dick Woodward, the pastor emeritus of the chapel, had a story that he used to tell pretty often about A guy who made a counseling appointment and came into his office and was frustrated. He was upset because he had been doing all these things that he thought he was supposed to do to try to grow his faith. And yet the results were disappointing. They were frustrating. They weren't happening the way that he expected them to. And so Dick told him, he goes, I know exactly what you need to do. And so the guy leans in and Dick says, here's what I need. I need you to wait until it gets dark. Then I need you to drive over to the Williamsburg winery. I need you to sneak into the vineyard. I need you to lay down on the ground and put your ear to the ground and listen. Just listen all night to how hard those grapes are working to grow. Dick's point was that Paul could have made this easier to understand. He could have made two lists, the works of the flesh versus the works of the Spirit. That's symmetrical. It's easy for us to understand. But he didn't do that. It's the works of the flesh versus the fruit of the Spirit. And fruit is different than works. This Spirit-filled life is not something that you can make happen on your own with effort, but something that grows depending on things beyond your ability. God is not asking you to somehow cause this growth in yourself. He is the one doing the work. He is growing it inside of you. And this doesn't mean that we are passive in this. It doesn't mean that it's easy. It doesn't mean that it's immediate or even linear. Right? It doesn't mean that we're always going to be progressing the way that we hope, that we're never going to have an obstacle or a stumbling block. Someone in my small group brought this up about a month ago. What do we do with the feeling when we're not growing, when we don't feel like the fruit are showing up the way we hoped? Some of us have been walking in the Spirit for a long time, and yet we don't necessarily seem like we're being more patient or gentle or good. In fact, it seems like we still struggle with the flesh that still pulls on us. I'll be vulnerable, admit this is how I feel sometimes, how I felt this week. I love preaching. I love getting to dive deep into God's word and trying to listen for the main idea of what's happening in the original context and then bring it forth into a way that applies to our modern lives. But one of the reasons I love preaching is a very selfish reason. And that's that on preaching weeks, I know that I am not smart enough to do the job I'm supposed to do. That I have to rely on wisdom and beauty that are beyond me, that I have to trust God more deeply, and there is a closeness that comes with that dependence that helps me not just preach, but do everything else that week because I'm depending on God in a more intense way than normal. But even still, this week, on a preaching week, in the span of 48 hours, I lost my temper. I yelled at each of my kids, one of them more than once. It wasn't patient. It wasn't gentle. It was flesh instead of fruit. And it's easy for this to happen in our lives. It's easy for flesh to overcome fruit, especially when we're facing difficult things. If we're dealing with sickness or grief or stress, the fruit of the Spirit can feel vague. It can feel disconnected from the gritty reality of our lives. But here is the amazing truth. The fruit of the Spirit are not only for sunny days when things are going well. The fruit are not circumstantial or situational. They are formational. Joy is not the absence of sorrow. Peace is not the absence of chaos. They are much, much deeper. Horatio Spafford was a 19th century lawyer from Chicago. He was a very successful lawyer. He lost a lot of money in the Great Chicago Fire of 1871. But in 1873, he and his family were traveling to England, and Spafford had to take a later ship. I don't remember the reason. But the first ship, with his wife and his 4 daughters, sank in the Atlantic, and all 4 of his girls died. And so Spafford caught another boat over to England and to be with his grieving wife. And as the ship made its way, it went past the general area where his daughters had died. And while he was on that trip, he wrote some pretty famous words. When peace like a river attendeth my way, when sorrows like sea billows roll, whatever my lot, thou hast taught me to say, it is well with my soul. That is not human. That is not flesh. You cannot tap into that joy and peace on your own. But this is what we can be transformed into in the Spirit. Walking in the Spirit means turning away from all of the limitations of our fleshy desires and being transformed into Christ-like fruit. So what does this actually look like in our life? What could this look like in your life? It might look like choosing love when it would be easier or safer to withdraw. It might look like finding joy even when life isn't going the way that you had hoped, or experiencing peace in the midst of grieving or chaos. It might mean showing more patience to your kids, to your coworkers, to your parents, or your spouse. It might look like extending kindness to someone that you don't think has earned that. It might be pursuing goodness when the status quo could be defended as being good enough, or remaining faithful when no one would notice if you weren't. It might look like responding with gentleness even when you're frustrated, or practicing self-control when everything inside of you just wants to give in. Which one of those feels hardest for you? So that gap might be where the Spirit is working in you right now to shore up our weaknesses with His strength. Because this is not a situation where you can pick and choose just one or two fruit that feel like a good fit for you, that you like, or that feel like they fit your personality. This growth is comprehensive. It's symmetrical. The Spirit wants us to grow in all of these ways because they are all signs of a transformed life, of a long walk in the Spirit, and becoming more like Jesus every day of our lives. This is how we are supposed to be growing, to be this well-rounded example of fruit. So this is my charge today to the people who are about to be baptized, but also to all of us on this Pentecost. It doesn't end here. It doesn't end today. The Spirit came on Pentecost, but He didn't leave. He stayed, dwelling deeply in each of you, so that tomorrow and the next day and the next day and the next day, for the rest of our lives, we need to learn how to walk in the Spirit, how to turn from the works of the flesh, how to grow in the fruit of the Spirit. So how do we do that? How do we do that? I want to close with 3 applications of how we can grow like the fruit of the Spirit, or grow in the fruit of the Spirit. First, we need to grow slow. Ann Jervis explained that the whole point of walking in this text, as opposed to running, implies continuance, progress, daily attention, which makes sense because you can't judge the growth of a plant by the second, by the hour, by the day, right? We have to take a longer view of things and value the consistency above intensity, recognizing that this is a marathon and not a sprint, that we are walking and not running. Second, we need to stay rooted. If you would like to bear fruit, you need a lot of things. You need the right soil, you need sunlight, you need water, and we need to be planted in community. We need to be spending time with God in prayer. We need to be being refreshed by His Word. And so ask yourself this. If you are trying to grow fruit of the Spirit in your life, ask yourself, are you consistently worshiping? Are you consistently learning? Are you consistently serving? Because we need all of those nutrients in order to grow. And third, we need to bear fruit for others. You know, plants are by nature generous. And what I mean is, if you think about an apple tree, does the apple tree get to eat the apple? No, we get to eat the apple, right? Does a flower get to appreciate the beauty of its bloom? No, it's for us. These plants, the fruit that they yield is for others. And in the same way, your growth is not solely about you. Nijay Gupta is a theologian who wrote a commentary on Galatians who explained it really well. He said, if there is one point that comes across plainly in this passage, it is that the Christian can be clearly identified by others as caring, just, full of integrity, and community-minded. Clearly identified by those things. The notion of a self-centered believer is a contradiction. God isn't growing this fruit in you just for you. He is growing it in you for the people around you as well. See, Pentecost is not the finish line. Neither is baptism. They're the beginning of a long walk that we all need to do. We need to walk in the Spirit when you feel on fire and when you don't. We need to walk in the Spirit in the big moments and in the ordinary. We need to trust. I need you to really trust that there is more inside of you than bones. There is more inside of you than DNA. There's more inside of you than your personal experiences or the skills that you bring to the table. There is something special in you, a holy fire that rages inside of you that has the power to help you turn away from the works of the flesh and to grow in the Spirit. There's a power in you that can take broken things and do amazing things, because the same helper that Jesus promised to his disciples who were broken, the same Spirit who comes down at Pentecost to all of those people, lives in you and can do amazing things both in you and through you.
Thanks for joining us today. Here at the chapel, we are all about making disciples of Jesus Christ. And we hope you'll join us as we walk the Exodus way and learn to trust God on the way out of Egypt, the way between in the wilderness, and the way into His presence.